A century ago, in the early days of aviation, an expert pilot with a lot of guts and a big heart thought of a unique way to spread holiday cheer to a distinct and often unnoticed group of important protectors. I'm Corey Kukuru for 1623 Studios, and this is the story of the Flying Santa. William Winkepaugh was born in the tiny peninsula town of Friendship, Maine in 1885. As a child, he had a mind for mechanics. He tinkered with bicycles and boats and was fascinated by automobiles and trains. But it was the unbelievable story from Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903 that brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright completed the first sustained, controlled flight of a machine heavier than air that hooked young William on aviation. Winkepaugh earned a mechanical engineering degree from the Pratt Institute in 1910, then pursued his dream of becoming a pilot by enrolling in the Curtiss Flying School at Coronado Island off San Diego. Named after aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss, who made the first long-distance flight in the U.S., the school was the first to train Army and Navy pilots, the first to practice takeoffs and landings on warships, and the first to launch float planes, or seaplanes. Winkepaugh earned his wings from the Aero Club of America, which issued the first pilot's licenses in the country. Winkepaugh also helped the Army Air Service train combat pilots during World War I. Then, capitalizing on the public's post-war fascination with aerial combat maneuvers and acrobatics, he worked the national barnstorming circuit for years, wowing spectators at fairs, festivals, and air shows with his exceptional flying skills. Impressed, Glenn Curtiss himself hired Winkepaugh to build and manage airports and seaplane facilities throughout New England. So Winkepaugh returned to Maine. Knowing how much reliable air service meant to Maine's coastal communities, he launched a commercial air delivery business in Rockland, ferrying people and supplies. On several occasions, Winkepaugh rescued sick or injured people in the region's most remote places. Many were out-of-work fishermen at abandoned encampments trying to survive the winters by hunting and trapping. Winkepaugh became intimately familiar with the thousands of islands that dot the coasts of New England, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Many of the excursions forced Winkepaugh to navigate through awful weather and ever-persistent New England fog. At a time when air-to-ground communication was nearly non-existent, lighthouses were vitally important reference points for coastal pilots. Before sophisticated electronic systems were developed, aviators relied on magnetic compasses, maps, and landmarks. Although designed for maritime navigation, lighthouses were so effective in aiding aeronautical navigation that the U.S. Lighthouse Service created its own Airways division. In 1716, Boston Light was the first lighthouse built by American colonists who counted almost entirely on trade and needed merchant ships to arrive safely into port. The U.S. Lighthouse Service was established just after the American Revolution. It was the first Public Works Act of the first U.S. Congress. The first lighthouse keepers were appointed to their position in each state. Many were veterans of the nation's early wars. When you think of a lighthouse keeper, you may picture a rugged, weathered, mysterious man with a weird mustache, and you wouldn't be wrong. Stag lighthouses, as they were called, were inhabited only by one person because they were deemed too difficult to access and too dangerous for wives and children. But many lighthouse stations were actually managed by families who lived in attached quarters, with duties passed down from one generation to the next. Women often were operators too, especially when their husbands were sick or had died. One cliché about all lighthouse keepers is true. They were extremely isolated. In sparsely populated regions, the only contact lighthouse keepers had with the real world was when supplies were brought to them, weather permitting. That meant endless months with little human interaction in a place where you're forever at the mercy of the elements. It was a brutal existence. Maintaining the light, the quarters, and the grounds was tedious and monotonous. When there was excitement, it was usually catastrophic: a blizzard, a flood, a shipwreck. Imagine having to row through a heavy chop in whiteout conditions to save bodies or retrieve dead ones, then have the wherewithal to find the way to shore. On December 21st, 1929, Captain Winkapaw was making his rounds along the coast of Maine from a single-engine floatplane in rapidly deteriorating conditions. A bad storm was bearing down. Hoping to finish before the storm hit, Winkapaw continued on his route until he realized he wouldn't make it. Blinded by thick falling snow and rattled by intense wind, Winkapaw tried turning back, but his compass stopped working. As visibility fell to zero, Winkapaw couldn't spot a visible landmark. Disoriented and running on empty, Winkapaw finally spotted a flicker of light through the windscreen. It was Dice Head Lighthouse in Penobscot Bay, 20 miles beyond his destination. Luckily, Winkapaw knew the area like the back of his hand. Knowing he may need to land at any moment, he lumbered from one lighthouse to the next. Guided only by their beacons, Winkapaw flew until he sputtered out of fuel and splashed down safely into Rockport Bay, less than 10 miles from where he had taken off. Just a few days later, on Christmas, as a gesture of gratitude to those who helped him home, Captain Winkapaw returned to the skies and airdropped care packages to the lighthouse keepers and their families. A Christmas-time tradition was born. It was the only way I had of saying thank you to the lighthouse keepers and Coast Guardsmen, Winkapaw said. I wanted to do something to lighten their loneliness. Every holiday season, Winkapaw gift-bombed presents weighing up to 16 pounds to more than 100 lighthouses and Coast Guard stations from the Canadian Maritimes to Rhode Island. His efforts made national headlines. Winkapaw became known as the Flying Santa. The Flying Santa routinely visited Cape Anne's lighthouses at Thatcher Island, Annisquam, Eastern Point, and 10-Pound Island. His son, Bill Jr., became the youngest licensed pilot in the state at the age of 17, and flew alone for portions of the lighthouse routes to reach more keepers and their families. As the Flying Santa's popularity grew, so did his itinerary. Winkapaw asked Bill Jr.'s high school teacher, Edward Rowe Snow, to help organize and promote the Flying Santa program and accompany Jr. on his Christmas flights. The aptly named Mr. Snow was a coastal historian descended from sea captains and a budding reconnaissance aerial photographer. He greatly admired the Winkapaws. Although he wasn't a pilot, Snow's enthusiasm helped secure the support of many regional corporations, including La Touraine Coffee Company, Bickford's Restaurants, and Wiggins Airways. Originally paid for entirely out of Winkapaw's pocket, the sponsorships ensured the program's continued success. By this time, the Coast Guard oversaw the nation's lighthouses. As the Flying Santa program expanded throughout New England, Captain Winkapaw flew the northern course, while Bill Jr. and Mr. Snow covered the south. In 1940, Snow, accompanied by his wife Anna Merle, got a Christmas present of their own as they neared Gloucester's 10-Pound Island, which was operated at the time by Edward Hopkins. Hopkins' wife Evelyn knew the Flying Santa was on his way early that morning, so she nailed stacks of papers to the ground and arranged them to spell Merry Christmas. Snow photographed the message and sent it to the Associated Press. The picture ran in newspapers across the country. The program existed sporadically during World War II, as the three Santas had wartime obligations. Bill Winkapaw flew missions retrieving gold and machinery from Bolivia. Bill Jr. became a flight instructor for the Navy. Snow worked as an Army Air Corps photographer in northern Africa. In late 1942, Snow was wounded during a bombing mission and spent Christmas recuperating in a hospital bed. But the following year, he continued the custom by hiring charter planes and playing the role of Santa himself. Under the direction of the Navy, when the Flying Santas could deliver gifts during the war, the words Christmas Sealplane were displayed in giant letters on the sides of their Santa sleighs to ensure they weren't mistaken for enemy aircraft. All three resumed their Yuletide duties after the war's end. The program's popularity grew even larger. Soon, Mr. Snow traveled as far south as St. Augustine, Florida. Then, on July 16, 1947, while piloting a sightseeing tour near his hometown in Rockland, Maine, Captain William Winkepaw suffered a heart attack and plunged a quarter-mile off the public landing. He and a passenger were killed. During his service, attended by representatives from the Army and Navy, lighthouse keepers around the region blasted foghorns and rang warning bells in tribute to the original Flying Santa. Edward Snow assumed all duties from the Winkepaws. That holiday season, he airdropped a wreath in Rockland Harbor to commemorate his old friend, then visited 176 lighthouses and Coast Guard stations. Snow remained active in the Flying Santa program for more than 40 years. Although it was expensive, the Snow family felt the benefits of the program were well worth the cost. Mr. Snow is also a renowned writer on Atlantic coastal and New England maritime history, authoring dozens of books and hosting a weekly radio show for children about the mysteries of the sea. For decades, the Flying Santa's holiday packages always included Snow's latest book, as well as self-addressed cards for the keepers to return, letting Snow know the success or failure of his gift bombs from above. The flights mostly went without a hitch, but, as is the nature of airdropping, 100% accuracy could not be guaranteed. Snow sometimes lowered to 35 feet off the ground to make drops. Yet once in a blue moon, the occasional package landed on a car, through a skylight, or somewhere in the deep blue sea. One time, Snow's Santa beard flew out of the plane, but it was recovered by a keeper and returned to Snow by mail with a note that read, "Here are your whiskers. Where's our package?" On a few occasions, the Coast Guard assisted Mr. Snow by providing aircraft. In 1953, Snow conducted the first transcontinental Santa flight, dropping packages to lights on the East Coast in the morning, then at the Great Lakes, and finally the West Coast to visit 36 stations in California and Oregon. By the 1970s, due to FAA regulations and insurance costs, some transports were made by boat, car, or helicopter. In any event, the Flying Santa returned year after year. In 1981, Snow suffered a stroke that prevented him from making any future deliveries. Hearing that New England's lighthouse families would not be visited by the Flying Santa for the first time since 1942, Judith Van Ham, the director of the Hull Life-Saving Museum, secured the volunteer services of pilot Ed McCabe in support of regional businesses. Ms. Van Ham organized that year's flight with McCabe at the controls, dressed in Edward Snow's red Santa suit. Edward Rowe Snow passed away in 1982 at the age of 79. In 5 decades of service as the Flying Santa, the beloved teacher, veteran, and author spread holiday cheer to thousands of lighthouse keepers, coasties, and their families. In the late 1980s, most lighthouses were gradually automated, meaning they could be operated without a lighthouse keeper. Yet the Flying Santas continue to visit Coast Guard bases and installations. The all-volunteer nonprofit Friends of Flying Santa was organized to run the program with a number of retired Coast Guardsmen serving as the Flying Santa. Presently, all lighthouses in the United States are automated. The last lighthouse keeper in the country retired from America's first lighthouse, the Boston Light, in 2023. Her name? I swear I'm not making this up, Sally Snowman. Today, the Friends of Flying Santa deliver gifts to hundreds of Coast Guard children at dozens of locations from Maine to New York, including some of the very lighthouses that Captain William Winkepaw visited nearly 100 years ago. As Mr. Snow once said, reading from the air, "Thank you, Flying Santa," spelled out in stones or driftwood on the ground below, then seeing happy people pick up the packages. It's a thrill. Merry Christmas!